83 men, half drunk on rum, rowed across a freezing lake in the dark and stole the most important fortress in North America without firing a single shot. Ethan Allen was born in 1738 in Connecticut, the eldest of 8 children. Sharp enough to argue theology before he was old enough to shave. He stood well over 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached 5'7", with a booming voice and a temper that filled any room he entered. His father's death ended any hope of formal education. Allen spent the next decade bouncing between failed business ventures, none of them making him rich or settled. What did consume him was land, specifically a contested stretch of territory between 2 colonies, where settlers had built farms on titles 2 governments both claimed. When the Crown sided against those settlers, surveyors arrived, demanding families either repay for land they already owned or abandon farms they had built by hand. Furious settlers organized a militia at a mountain tavern, electing Allen as their commander. They called themselves the Green Mountain Boys, and they meant business. For years, they burned survey stakes, tore down fences, and physically intimidated anyone attempting to enforce rival land claims across the contested territory. A colonial governor declared Allen an outlaw with a bounty on his head. Allen responded by offering his own counter-bounty on the officials who had condemned him. In April 1775, gunfire erupted between British soldiers and colonial militia in Massachusetts. Within days, that news reached the mountains, and everything changed instantly. A crumbling stone fortress sat on a bluff overlooking a critical lake corridor. Once fiercely contested, now considered forgotten by nearly everyone who mattered. By 1775, that fort held barely 2 officers and roughly 46 soldiers guarding walls that were crumbling and barracks that leaked through every crack. But that fort still held nearly 60 cannons, mortars, and howitzers. Artillery the newly forming Continental Army desperately needed and did not remotely possess. 2 separate colonial groups reached the exact same idea simultaneously, unaware the other existed, both racing toward the same isolated, undefended fortress. One rider pushed his horse so hard it collapsed from exhaustion on the road. He found another mount immediately and kept riding without slowing down. He arrived just as Allen assembled roughly 150 men, bursting in and demanding command of the entire operation using an official military commission. The Green Mountain Boys made their loyalty clear immediately. They would fight for Allen, or they would simply walk home. No stranger's paperwork would change that. That night, the men gathered at a tavern and drank round after round of a potent rum and hard cider mixture, fueling themselves for what came next. By 11:30 that night, roughly 150 men waited on the shore, ready to cross the lake. The promised boats were nowhere in sight. The boats finally arrived around 1:30 in the morning, far too few for everyone. They could carry only 83 men on the first crossing. Waiting for a second crossing risked discovery at dawn. Allen made the call immediately. They would go now with what they had and hope it was enough. 83 farmers and woodsmen rowed across freezing water in the dark, carrying muskets and swords, with no artillery, no uniforms, and no real battle plan. They landed on the shore, just as the first gray light touched the sky, forming into a column and moving directly toward the fortress entrance. A single sentry at the gate raised his musket and pulled the trigger. The weapon misfired completely. The startled sentry turned and fled inside immediately. Allen and his men charged through the entrance directly behind him. What followed was less a battle and far more a violent, chaotic wake-up call. British soldiers stumbled out of their bunks half asleep, reaching desperately for weapons they could not immediately find in the chaos and confusion. Allen made straight for the officers' quarters at the top of a narrow staircase, determined to end the entire situation before real resistance could form. The first officer they found came to his door in his nightclothes, utterly bewildered by why armed men were flooding through his fortress at dawn. Allen demanded immediate surrender. The officer asked by what authority such a demand was even being made. What Allen said next became instant legend. Moments later, the fort's actual commander emerged, looked at the sword pointed his way and the courtyard full of armed men, and simply surrendered. Not one person was killed on either side. The first offensive American victory of the entire Revolutionary War had taken barely 10 minutes to complete. With the fort secured, Allen's men did exactly what any celebrating militia would do. They immediately began searching for anything useful or drinkable. They found the commanding officer's private stockpile of 90 gallons of rum, and by noon, that entire supply had been completely emptied by celebrating soldiers. Allen later described that morning with total sincerity, claiming the sun rose with superior luster as his men toasted liberty over the flowing bowl. The rival commander was not amused at all, complaining bitterly about plundering and collapsed discipline and about being denied any real authority whatsoever. None of that personal friction mattered against what actually sat inside those walls. 59 cannons, mortars, and howitzers, exactly what the revolution desperately needed. The task of moving 60 tons of captured weapons fell to a 25-year-old Boston bookseller who had taught himself artillery science entirely from imported manuals. He organized 42 custom sledges pulled by 80 yoke of oxen, launching a 300-mile winter journey that would take 10 grueling weeks to complete. Rivers along the route were dangerously unpredictable, thick enough to be treacherous, but not always thick enough to hold a 2-ton cannon safely. The young officer nearly froze to death, walking through waist-deep snow during a blizzard, later writing that the difficulties were nearly impossible to fully describe. Every single cannon arrived intact. Not one had been permanently lost across 300 brutal miles of frozen wilderness and treacherous winter terrain. On the night of March 4th, 1776, 2,000 soldiers moved those cannons onto the high ground overlooking Boston's harbor, working through total darkness. By dawn, British soldiers looked up and saw 60 tons of captured artillery pointed directly down at their ships and barracks. The math was simple and final. On March 17th, 1776, 11,000 British troops and over 1,000 Loyalist civilians evacuated Boston entirely without firing a single shot. Within days of the original capture, a nearby fort fell just as easily. placing the entire strategic lake corridor firmly under American control almost overnight. Congress celebrated Allen as a genuine hero, absorbing his militia into the Continental Army, though formal command soon passed instead to his own cousin. Undeterred, Allen joined the American invasion of Canada that summer, eager for the next fight, regardless of rank or formal military authority. He led a reckless, unauthorized attack on Montreal with barely 100 men, expecting support that never arrived on the opposite side of the city. Surrounded and badly outnumbered, Allen was captured by British forces that September, delighted to finally hold the man who had humiliated them at Ticonderoga. He spent 2.5 brutal years in British custody, moved between prison ships, English confinement, and jail cells, narrowly avoiding execution as a traitor. Finally released in a prisoner exchange in 1778, Allen returned home, taking command of the Vermont militia and pursuing statehood for the territory he loved. He died in February 1789 at the age of 51, just 2 years before Vermont finally achieved the statehood he had spent years fighting for. The fortress itself changed hands twice more during the war, before losing all strategic relevance following a decisive American victory further south. Today, that fortress stands restored as a quiet museum, its cannons long scattered across battlefields, its walls telling a story most visitors barely know. No authentic portrait of Ethan Allen survives today. Statues honoring him were modeled by his own nephew, since nobody bothered painting him while he lived. The capture was never meant to be a turning point. It began as a land dispute grudge, decided in tavern back rooms by men fighting over deeds, not liberty. But those captured cannons gave Washington the leverage to break Boston's siege, and that siege gave the entire revolution its first genuine strategic momentum. That momentum carried through years of hardship and near collapse, all the way to the final British surrender at Yorktown 5 years later in 1781. A fortress fell before dawn to a half-drunk militia leader waving a sword in the dark, and the trajectory of an entire war changed because of it. 83 farmers, half-drunk on rum and cider, stole the most strategically important fortress in North America without firing a shot, and the cannons they captured broke the siege of Boston months later. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which moment from the Revolution you want us to cover next.